You find yourself standing on the bank of the Euphrates River, in a city that has already been lived in for centuries before your arrival. This is Babylon, not in its mythic form, not in the exaggerations of biblical scribes or the elaborate stories of later historians, but in its practical, sun-baked reality. The air is heavy with the scent of mud, straw, and stagnant water. If you were to survive here, even for a single day, you would first need to understand that life in Babylon was a rhythm of necessity, an endless negotiation with heat, water, and clay. The river dominates everything. Without the Euphrates, there is no Babylon. The city grew on its banks, dependent on irrigation canals dug, dredged, and maintained by countless hands over generations. Each year, when the waters rose, they brought both sustenance and destruction. Too little flooding meant famine, too much meant ruin. The king, whoever he happened to be in your time of arrival, perhaps Hammurabi, perhaps Nebuchadnezzar, was tasked not only with ruling but with ensuring that water flowed correctly. Entire bureaucracies, scribes with styluses and wet clay tablets, tracked how much grain was stored, how much water was diverted, and how much labor could be demanded from ordinary people to keep the canals clear. You, as an outsider, would not understand at first how much of Babylonian life was written into clay. From the temple records to simple receipts, clay tablets were everywhere, baked by the sun or in kilns to last for millennia. A clay tablet might be the size of your hand, pressed with small wedges that represented numbers or words. To Babylonian eyes, they were as ordinary as paper is to you. If you lived here, you would have to learn to read at least the symbols of measures, how many shekels of silver, how many jars of beer, how many baskets of dates. Without that, you would be lost in transactions. Imagine trying to buy bread in the marketplace without understanding that 3 lines pressed into a corner might mean 3 measures of barley owed. But before you even reached the marketplace, you would need to navigate the city itself. Babylon was not laid out with modern comfort in mind. The streets were narrow, winding, and often filled with refuse. Wastewater might flow openly in the gutters, carrying with it the stench of animals and people alike. The walls of houses leaned inward over these streets, shading them, trapping both cool air and odor. Houses themselves were built of sun-dried mud brick, cheap, plentiful, and fragile. You could build a home with relative ease, but within a few decades, the bricks would crumble, the plaster would peel, and someone would need to rebuild. This cycle of decay and rebuilding defined the city. If you stayed here long enough, you would realize Babylon was less a permanent monument and more a continuous act of maintenance. Inside a Babylonian home, you would find simplicity. Rooms were arranged around a central courtyard, where light filtered in. The courtyard was where much of daily life happened, food was prepared, children played, and air circulated. The interiors were plain, with reed mats and low wooden stools. Wealthier homes might have plastered walls painted with geometric designs, but most were left bare. Privacy was minimal, as multiple generations shared space. If you came from a world of individual bedrooms and personal belongings, you would find this communal arrangement both comforting and claustrophobic. Food, too, was both simple and calculated. Barley was the foundation of the Babylonian diet. It could be eaten as bread, boiled into porridge, or brewed into beer. Beer was not a luxury but a staple, consumed by everyone, including children, because it was safer than much of the water. Alongside barley, dates provided sweetness and energy. Herds of sheep and goats supplied milk and meat, though meat was eaten sparingly by most. Fish from the Euphrates were more common, though often salted or dried. To preserve them, spices were limited, and meals were repetitive. To live in Babylon was to grow accustomed to cycles of abundance and shortage, tied always to the river and the harvest. If you were to survive a single day here, you would also need to understand labor. Most people worked from dawn until dusk, whether in fields, workshops, or temples. The temple was not only a place of worship but an economic hub, owning large tracts of land and employing countless workers. Farmers brought their grain to the temple storehouses, while weavers, metalworkers, and brewers supplied goods. Each was bound by obligation, sometimes through debt, sometimes through inherited duty. To fall behind in one's obligations meant more than shame, it could mean losing your land, your freedom, or even being sold into slavery. Debt slavery was a reality here, one that tied families for generations. Religion wove through every part of life. The gods were not distant abstractions but immediate forces. Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, demanded rituals and offerings. Temples rose high above the city, with the ziggurat looming as a reminder of divine power. Priests interpreted omens from the liver of a sacrificed sheep or the patterns of the stars. You, as an outsider, might dismiss such rituals, but to the Babylonians, they were as practical as engineering. To ignore the will of the gods was to invite disaster. Even the king ruled by divine sanction, presenting himself as the chosen instrument of Marduk. Trade kept the city alive, and the marketplace would overwhelm you with its noise. Merchants shouted prices, scribes kept records, and animals jostled through narrow lanes. You might see goods from distant lands, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar wood from Lebanon, copper from Oman. Babylon was a hub, drawing wealth from across Mesopotamia and beyond. But trade was not simple barter. Silver, weighed carefully on balances, was the standard of exchange. Fraud was common, and scales were watched closely. If you could not navigate these transactions, you would quickly be cheated. The legal system offered some protection, though it was harsh by modern standards. Hammurabi's famous code inscribed on a black stone stele might be cited, but justice in practice depended on status. If you were wealthy, your word carried more weight than a poor man's. If you were free, your rights were greater than those of a slave. Punishments varied accordingly, fines for some, mutilation or death for others. To survive here, you would need to be careful not only in your dealings but in your speech and behavior, for a careless insult or accusation might lead to consequences you could not escape. The heat pressed down on you, relentless. Shade was scarce, and water carried risk. Disease thrived in crowded quarters, in stagnant canals, and in refuse left to rot. Physicians existed, trained in both herbal remedies and incantations, but their success was limited. Illness was as much a matter of divine displeasure as of infection, and treatments reflected this dual belief. You might receive a poultice of herbs, followed by a prayer or ritual to drive out the demon thought to cause your suffering. To live in Babylon was to balance the practical with the spiritual, never separating one from the other. As the day faded, the city changed. Torches lit the streets, though danger lurked in the dark. Thieves and debt collectors prowled, while guards patrolled in the name of the king. Within homes, families gathered around shared meals, telling stories or reciting hymns. The night sky stretched wide, filled with stars that Babylonian astronomers studied with careful precision. These astronomers, working atop ziggurats, recorded celestial patterns that would influence calendars, rituals, and even political decisions. You might marvel at their skill, but to them, it was another form of reading the will of the gods. And so the cycle of Babylonian life continued: work, worship. Survival. If you were to step into this world, even for a single day, you would find yourself overwhelmed by its demands. The heat, the labor, the strict order of society, the constant presence of debt and duty, all would press upon you. And yet, beneath it all, you would sense the resilience of a people who had built one of the most enduring cities in history, who shaped clay into words and measured the heavens with patience. Still, you might wonder, what happened when the balance failed, when the river ran too high, when debts became too great, when the gods seemed silent? What did survival look like in Babylon when the delicate system holding life together began to crack? If you managed to last through your first day in Babylon, navigating its crowded alleys, consuming its thick barley beer, and adjusting to the cycle of labor, your survival would next depend on understanding the larger systems that structured every aspect of life. For the Babylonians, survival was not only about food and water. It was about order. Order in the cosmos, order in the family, and order in the kingdom. To live here, you would have to accept, or at least endure, that your life was part of a vast network of obligations, hierarchies, and expectations. At the heart of this system was the king. To you, he might appear a distant figure, gilded in ceremonial robes and rarely seen except during festivals or public proclamations. But his presence extended into every canal, every transaction, every tablet of clay. The king was not merely a political ruler, he was the guarantor of justice and cosmic balance. Hammurabi, whose name you may recall from the famous legal code, described himself as a shepherd chosen by the gods to bring law to his people. Later kings, like Nebuchadnezzar II, emphasized their role as builders, responsible for temples, walls, and monuments that honored the gods and secured the city. Whether shepherd or builder, the king was never just a man, he was an essential link between the divine and the earthly. And yet, the king's authority was only as strong as the machinery beneath him. Scribes, judges, tax collectors, and priests, all acted in his name. If you fell into debt, it was not the king himself who would appear at your door, but a collector wielding a clay tablet with your obligations inscribed upon it. If you were accused of wrongdoing, it was not the king who passed judgment, but a panel of judges applying laws remembered and recorded for centuries. The king's power was real, but it was diffuse, filtered through a web of bureaucracy that touched the lives of ordinary Babylonians in ways both visible and invisible. The Babylonian legal system is famous for its severity, but to the people living under it, it was also a source of stability. Imagine you were a farmer who had borrowed seed grain from a wealthy landowner. The harvest failed, and now you could not repay what you owed. Under the law, the creditor might seize not only your land but also your children, binding them into debt servitude until the obligation was fulfilled. To you, this might seem unbearably cruel, but to Babylonians, it was part of the natural order. Debt was as binding as kinship, and to break faith with one's creditor was to upset the balance of society. From time to time, kings issued edicts canceling debts, freeing those enslaved by obligation, and restoring land to its former owners. These decrees, known as debt jubilees, were not acts of generosity but of necessity, tools to reset the system when inequality threatened to tear it apart. Without such interventions, the poor might revolt, and the delicate machinery of Babylon would grind to a halt. Daily life was filled with such negotiations of status and duty. Families arranged marriages not only for companionship but for alliances, for securing dowries, and for ensuring stability across generations. A woman in Babylon had certain rights: she could own property, conduct business, and even initiate divorce under specific circumstances. Yet her position remained tied to the household, and her value was often measured in silver or goods exchanged at the time of marriage. To live in Babylon was to recognize that every relationship carried a weight, inscribed not just in affection but in obligation. Even religion, which might appear to you as a matter of personal faith, was deeply entangled with these obligations. Temples dominated the skyline not only because of their religious significance but because of their economic might. The Great Ziggurat of Babylon, later remembered as the Tower of Babel, was less a tower to heaven than a monumental display of wealth and labor. The temple complex functioned as a bank, a warehouse, and an administrative hub. Farmers deposited grain in temple storehouses, merchants borrowed silver from temple treasuries, and priests oversaw the redistribution of resources. The gods were not abstract, they were landlords, creditors, and employers. When you gave an offering to Marduk or Ishtar, you were also reinforcing the economic system that kept Babylon alive. The festivals, however, revealed the deeper layer beneath this system. During the New Year festival, the king himself was required to humble his body and spirit before Marduk. In a ritual both striking and humbling, the high priest would strike the king's face and pull him by the ear, forcing him to declare that he had ruled justly. If tears fell from the king's eyes, it was taken as a sign that Marduk approved. To you, this might look like humiliation, but to the Babylonians, it was renewal, proof that even the king was subject to the divine order. Survival in Babylon required constant reassurance that the gods remained in balance, that the heavens and earth aligned, and that the fragile city on the banks of the Euphrates still held divine favor. Outside the grandeur of temples and palaces, ordinary work continued in patterns that would feel monotonous yet essential. Farmers rose with the sun to tend fields of barley, their labor dictated by the calendar of floods and planting. Irrigation canals required endless maintenance, dredging silt, patching embankments, and repairing breaches caused by the river's unpredictable currents. Craftsmen in the city bent over looms, furnaces, or workbenches, their hands repeating movements practiced by generations before them. Weavers produced linen and wool garments, while potters shaped clay vessels used for everything from cooking to storing beer. Metalworkers crafted tools, weapons, and ornaments, though bronze and iron were expensive and often imported. To live here meant to specialize, to inherit your trade from your parents, and to measure your skill not in innovation but in consistency. And yet, trade brought glimpses of the wider world into Babylon's dusty streets. You might see caravans arriving from distant lands, their donkeys laden with timber, metals, or rare stones. The marketplace was both chaotic and ordered, a place where local farmers bartered alongside merchants from far-off cities. The clatter of goods, the shouts of traders, and the ever-present smell of beer brewing would surround you. But beneath the noise was calculation, every jar of oil, every bolt of cloth, every measure of grain was weighed, recorded, and taxed. To survive here, you would need not only to know the goods themselves but the intricate measures and standards that governed them. A dishonest weight could ruin a reputation, or, if discovered, lead to harsh punishment under the law. Health and medicine offered another glimpse into the Babylonian blend of practicality and belief. If you fell ill, you might be visited by an ASU, a healer who applied remedies drawn from plants, minerals, and animal products. Instructions for these treatments were carefully recorded on clay tablets, detailing not only the ingredients but the rituals to accompany them. Alongside the healer, you might also consult an asapul, a diviner priest who sought to uncover the spiritual cause of your illness. Perhaps it was the result of neglecting an offering, or of angering a protective spirit. A single sickness could thus draw you into the twin realms of natural and supernatural remedies. Even if you doubted the prayers, you might submit to them, for survival here was not only physical but also social. Refusing ritual might mark you as impious, dangerous, or cursed. At night, when the city quieted and only the distant sound of guards' footsteps echoed in the alleys, the stars revealed another dimension of Babylonian survival. Astronomers, perched on the ziggurat, traced the patterns of planets and constellations. They did not separate astronomy from astrology. The movement of the heavens was a message from the gods, guiding kings and shaping decisions. These records, kept over centuries, became some of the most precise astronomical observations in the ancient world. To you, the connection between Mars and a failed harvest might seem tenuous, but to Babylon, the alignment of heaven and earth was undeniable. If the stars predicted disaster, preparations were made. If they promised success, the city celebrated. To ignore the heavens was to risk imbalance, and imbalance was death. But beneath the appearance of order, tension always lurked. Floods could sweep away fields, foreign armies could march across the plains, or debt could spiral beyond forgiveness. Ordinary people had little power to resist such forces. A farmer might pray for mercy, a craftsman might offer extra sacrifices, a mother might whisper charms over her child's cradle, but ultimately, survival in Babylon was precarious. The very systems that supported life, irrigation, debt, temple, and king, could also destroy it. You might find yourself asking, then, how long could this fragile balance hold? Could a city so dependent on river, ritual, and hierarchy truly endure the pressures of nature and time? Or was Babylon, for all its grandeur, always destined to crumble beneath the weight of clay it had so carefully inscribed? You have now spent more than a day in Babylon, and you have survived, though not without difficulty. You have walked the alleys filled with waste and dust, eaten the flat bread of barley, drunk the cloudy beer, and endured the weight of obligations carried on clay tablets. You have learned that Babylon is not only a place but a system, of water, of law, of debt, of gods, and of kings. Yet systems, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually face pressures too great to withstand. And so, to understand Babylon, you must follow its story not only in its daily routines but in its long arc of endurance, struggle, and decline. The city, at its height, was immense for its time. Ancient writers would later exaggerate, claiming that its walls stretched for miles, thick enough for chariots to race upon. Some accounts, like those of Herodotus, are colored by wonder and myth, describing gardens that reached the heavens and palaces clad in dazzling brickwork. Beneath the exaggeration, however, was a real city, one of the largest in the ancient world, its population perhaps surpassing 200,000. To live here was to live in a place that drew the wealth of Mesopotamia into its gates, grain from the river valley, timber from distant mountains, and goods carried by caravan and ship. Its size gave it power, but also vulnerability, for the larger the city, the more fragile its balance became. Consider the canals once more. They brought life, but they also demanded endless labor. Silt filled them, floods damaged them, and rival communities diverted them. When the canals failed, famine followed. Entire dynasties rose and fell on their ability to maintain this fragile infrastructure. The king's legitimacy was measured as much in repaired levies as in military victories. In times of strength, the canals flowed, the fields prospered, and temples filled with offerings. But when kings grew weak, when rival powers pressed in, or when internal dissent fractured unity, the system faltered. To live in Babylon was to live always one failed harvest away from collapse. War, too, was a constant shadow. The fertile plain of Mesopotamia invited not only prosperity but conquest. Armies from the north, south, and west marched repeatedly through these lands. Assyrians, Elamites, Persians, all sought to control Babylon, to claim its wealth and its symbolic power. For Babylon was not just a city, it was an idea, a place that represented civilization itself to many ancient peoples. To conquer Babylon was to legitimize one's rule, to become heir to a legacy that stretched back centuries. This made Babylon both prestigious and perpetually endangered. And yet, despite invasions, Babylon endured. It adapted, rebuilt, and reasserted itself. When Hammurabi forged his code and his empire in the 18th century BCE, Babylon was a rising power. When Nebuchadnezzar II reigned in the 6th century BCE, the city reached a height of magnificence remembered for millennia. He expanded its walls, built towering temples, and supposedly commissioned the Hanging Gardens, though whether they truly existed in Babylon or in another city is still debated. To you, arriving in his time, Babylon might have seemed eternal, its streets bustling with traders, its ziggurat reaching into the sky, its palaces gleaming with glazed brick. Yet beneath the grandeur, the same fragile foundations remained, mud brick walls that crumbled with rain, canals that clogged with silt, debts inscribed on clay that could ruin families. Religion offered stability, but also rigidity. The gods demanded endless attention, sacrifices, hymns, festivals. Omens were read, stars observed, and rituals performed to maintain cosmic balance. For centuries, this system gave Babylon a sense of order, but it also left the city resistant to change. As new powers rose, Assyrians with their military might, Persians with their vast empire, Babylon's reliance on its traditional order both defined its identity and limited its adaptability. The rituals that once bound society together could not protect it from foreign conquest. The Persians, under Cyrus the Great, entered Babylon in 539 BCE without resistance. The city, so often the center of power, became a province within a larger empire. Cyrus portrayed himself not as a conqueror but as a liberator, respecting Babylonian gods and restoring temples. To the people, daily life may have changed little at first, the canals still required dredging, barley still needed to be planted, debt still demanded payment. Yet the center of authority had shifted. Babylon was no longer the heart of an empire but a jewel in another's crown. Over time, its influence waned, its monuments decayed, and its name became more a memory than a reality. And yet, Babylon never truly disappeared. Its culture, its knowledge, and even its language echoed through centuries. The astronomical records kept by its priests informed Greek science. Its legal traditions influenced later systems of law. Its myths, recorded on clay tablets, shaped stories retold across generations, the flood narrative that found its way into the Epic of Gilgamesh, and from there into biblical texts. Even the very image of Babylon, as a place of pride, decadence, and eventual downfall, endured in the imaginations of later peoples. To early Christians, Babylon became a symbol of corruption and exile. To medieval travelers, it was a lost wonder. To modern archaeologists, it was a puzzle of ruins and inscriptions buried beneath desert sands. But what did it mean, for those who lived there, when the city fell from greatness? Did the farmer along the Euphrates notice when authority shifted from Babylonian to Persian to Macedonian hands? Did the potter in his workshop feel the decline of empire, or did he simply continue shaping clay as his ancestors had? To most, survival remained the same: plant, harvest, pay dues. Endure heat, pray for health. The grandeur of empire may have shifted above their heads, but the weight of clay, of obligations, of debts, of survival, never lifted. The ruins of Babylon today tell a quieter story than the myths suggest. The mighty walls are reduced to mounds of crumbling mud brick. The ziggurat is flattened, its steps eroded by time. Fragments of glazed brick, once brilliant blue and gold, lie scattered. And yet, from these remains, archaeologists have pieced together a vision of ordinary life, tablets recording grain rations for workers, contracts for the sale of fields, letters between merchants negotiating trade. It is not the gardens or palaces that speak most clearly across time, but the humble records of survival. The very clay that weighed on Babylon's people preserved their lives for us to see. And so you realize, you would not have survived a day in Babylon not because the city was cruel, but because it demanded endurance on terms unfamiliar to you. It required acceptance of communal living, submission to cosmic order, tolerance for monotony, and resilience in the face of constant vulnerability. To you, such a life might feel unbearable. To them, it was simply life. Babylon's story, then, is not only one of kings and conquests, but of ordinary people who navigated its fragile balance every day. They endured heat, rebuilt walls, repaid debts, and trusted in gods whose power seemed as real as the river's flood. And though the city itself fell, their persistence ensured that fragments of their world reached us. Babylon's fragility became its legacy, an enduring reminder that even the greatest cities are only as strong as the clay upon which they are built. So when you hear the name Babylon today, and imagine its towering walls and hanging gardens, remember also the mud brick houses, the barley porridge, the crowded alleys, and the endless obligations pressed into clay. Remember that beneath the myths was a city both ordinary and extraordinary. A place where survival was never guaranteed, but where people lived nonetheless, shaping history in ways that still echo. And you might ask yourself, if Babylon, with all its wealth, knowledge, and grandeur, could not endure forever, what does that say about the cities we build today, standing as they do on their own fragile foundations? When you think of the Roman Empire, it is easy to picture emperors wrapped in togas, standing proudly before marble columns, or legions marching across battlefields with their standards raised high. Yet beneath all of these grand images lies something far more ordinary, and at first glance, far less exciting: the road. Without the road, Rome could not have fed its cities, moved its armies, or bound together its vast and scattered provinces. The story of Rome's roads begins in the 4th century BCE, when the city was still only one power among many on the Italian peninsula. At this time, travel was unreliable. Dirt tracks twisted across the landscape, turning to mud in winter and dust in summer. Armies bogged down in bad weather, farmers struggled to move their goods, and communication across even modest distances was slow. For a city that aspired to control not just its neighbors but the entire peninsula, such conditions were intolerable. Thus, in 312 BCE, the censor Appius Claudius Caecus initiated the construction of what would become the most famous of all Roman roads, the Via Appia. Originally running from Rome to Capua, and eventually extended to Brundisium, the Via Appia was a revolutionary project. It was not a mere track beaten flat by countless feet and hooves. It was engineered, deliberately surveyed, and built to last. So proud were the Romans of this achievement that they named it the Queen of Roads. The genius of the Roman road lay in its construction. First, engineers dug a trench, ensuring that the base would be stable. Into this trench went large stones, fitted together to form a foundation. Above this came layers of gravel, crushed stone, and sand, each packed tightly. Finally, large polygonal paving stones, carefully shaped and set without mortar, created the surface. The road was slightly arched in the center, allowing rain to run off into drainage ditches at the sides. This design, though simple in concept, made the roads incredibly durable. Many sections remain visible, and even usable, over 2,000 years later. Roman surveyors were trained to seek straightness above all else. Whenever possible, their roads cut directly across landscapes, refusing to bend or curve unless absolutely necessary. To achieve this, they used tools such as the groma, a cross-shaped device with plumb lines, which allowed them to align long, straight segments even across uneven terrain. The results were roads that marched forward with unyielding precision. Valleys were bridged, hills were cut down, and swamps were filled. To a Roman engineer, nature was an obstacle to be overcome, not respected. It is worth pausing here to imagine the human effort involved. Soldiers themselves often performed the labor, particularly when roads were built for military purposes. Legionaries, accustomed to digging trenches and constructing fortifications during campaigns, brought the same skills to roadwork. Others who labored were convicts or enslaved people, pressed into service to break rocks, move earth, and haul heavy stones into place. These were not glamorous tasks. They were sweaty, backbreaking, and often dangerous. Yet the results served the empire for centuries. Why did Rome invest so heavily in roads? At first, the answer was simple: war. Armies could not move swiftly along muddy tracks. Supplies could not reach front lines if carts bogged down in marshes. By creating reliable highways, Rome ensured that its legions could march 20 or more miles in a single day, fully armed and provisioned. Messages moved with similar speed. In an age without telephones or radios, this logistical advantage was decisive. Military victories were not won only on battlefields but also on the stone beneath soldiers' sandals. But once built, the roads quickly took on broader purposes. Farmers could bring surplus grain to city markets. Merchants could transport amphorae filled with olive oil, wine, or garum, the pungent fish sauce beloved by Romans, from one region to another. Craftsmen could carry pottery, tools, or textiles farther than ever before. What began as an instrument of conquest evolved into the circulatory system of a vast economy. At the gates of Rome itself, you would have seen these roads radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. Each one led not just to another town but to entire provinces. Along them stood stone milestones, called miliaria, inscribed with distances from the city. These markers reinforced a powerful idea, that all roads ultimately led to Rome, the center of the world as Romans understood it. Travelers might pass through forests, mountains, and plains, but the milestones always pointed back to the capital, a subtle but constant reminder of imperial authority. Of course, walking along these roads was not a luxurious experience. The paving stones, while durable, were uneven and jarring for carts. Wheels rattled loudly, and animals strained against their loads. In summer, heat shimmered off the stones, while in winter, icy winds swept across open stretches. Dust rose in dry weather, coating clothing and stinging eyes. Travelers wore sturdy sandals, thick cloaks, and broad-brimmed hats, carrying their belongings in small packs or on mules. For the ordinary person, the journey was tiring and often uncomfortable, but the very possibility of traveling safely and predictably over long distances was itself a remarkable improvement. Along the way, weary travelers might stop at way stations or inns, called mansions. These establishments, spaced at intervals along major routes, provided food, drink, and beds, though not always of the highest quality. Bread, olives, and cheese were common fare, washed down with watered wine. Beds were often shared with strangers, and theft was a real risk. Still, they offered relief to those who could afford them. For poorer travelers, sleeping by the roadside or in makeshift shelters was the norm. From Rome's perspective, the road system was both a practical tool and a statement of power. Every paved mile declared the empire's presence, binding conquered lands into a single network. As roads multiplied, they created new patterns of settlement. Towns sprang up at crossroads, markets flourished near way stations, and communities adapted to the constant flow of travelers and goods. The landscape itself was reshaped, ordered according to the needs of an empire that prized control above all else. Today, when you walk on the Via Appia, its ancient stones worn smooth by countless feet and wheels, you cannot help but wonder, did those who first laid them know that they were building not just a road but the very foundation of an empire's might? Or did they simply see themselves as laborers, sweating in the Italian sun, unaware of how far their work would carry Rome? If the first Roman roads were built to carry legions into battle, their long-term legacy lay in what they carried after the swords were sheathed. Once paved paths stretched across Italy and far into the provinces, the Roman world found itself more interconnected than ever before. The road, at once ordinary and unremarkable, became the stage upon which the daily life of the empire unfolded. Imagine a merchant at dawn, leading a mule laden with amphorae filled with olive oil from Hispania. The air is cool, the road quiet save for the clatter of hooves on stone. As the sun rises, the highway grows busier. A caravan of carts loaded with grain creaks along toward the city. Soldiers march in steady formation, their iron-shod sandals clicking in rhythm. Couriers ride swiftly, carrying sealed tablets of orders from distant governors to Rome itself. All of this traffic converges along the same carefully engineered pathways, transforming the roads into the arteries of commerce and governance. The economic effects of the Roman roads cannot be overstated. Before their construction, local markets dominated daily life. A farmer might sell surplus grain or vegetables only within a few miles of his fields. A potter's wares rarely traveled beyond a neighboring town. But once reliable roads linked cities and provinces, goods began to circulate on a scale previously impossible. Grain, the lifeblood of Rome's ever-hungry population, was one of the most significant commodities transported. While massive shipments came by sea from Egypt and North Africa, inland regions also contributed. Cartloads of wheat and barley made their way along roads from fertile valleys into urban centers. Livestock, too, traveled the highways, herds of sheep, goats, and cattle driven by drovers, their bells clanging as they passed. Specialty goods followed the same paths. From Gaul came fine pottery and wine, from Hispania, olive oil and metals such as silver and copper, from the east, silks, spices, and perfumes. Traders often traveled in groups for protection, their carts covered with cloth to shield goods from dust and rain. Roads made such journeys predictable, distances were marked, spaced at intervals, and bridges replaced treacherous fords. What had once been a dangerous gamble became, while still challenging, a manageable endeavor. The government itself invested heavily in ensuring that trade moved smoothly. Bridges and causeways were repaired regularly, often at the expense of local communities. Inscriptions on milestones proudly recorded which official had overseen recent improvements, a subtle reminder that Rome's prosperity was inseparable from its ruler's attention. Perhaps the most remarkable use of the roads was communication. The empire stretched thousands of miles, from Britain to Syria, and yet orders issued in Rome could reach distant provinces with surprising speed. This was made possible through the cursus publicus, the Roman state's courier system, established by Augustus. The cursus publicus relied on a network of way stations spaced roughly every 10 to 15 miles. At each, fresh horses and riders waited. Couriers could thus travel day and night, changing mounts as they went. Messages that might otherwise take weeks could be delivered in days. Suetonius, the historian, claimed that news of Emperor Augustus's death in Nola reached Rome in less than 24 hours, a staggering speed for the ancient world. These couriers carried more than just political orders. Military intelligence, tax records, and census reports flowed constantly along the roads. Governors informed the Senate of local unrest, generals requested reinforcements or celebrated victories. Without this system of rapid communication, the vast empire would have been impossible to govern. Yet the cursus publicus was not for everyone. Ordinary citizens could not use it, except in rare cases where they carried official permits. For common correspondence, letters moved much more slowly, entrusted to merchants, travelers, or private messengers. Still, the very existence of such a system demonstrates the central role of roads in maintaining imperial control. With roads came new dangers as well. Banditry was a persistent problem. Travelers carrying valuables, whether merchants or wealthy officials, were tempting targets. Forested stretches of road or remote mountain passes provided ample hiding places for brigands. Ancient authors often warn of such dangers, describing gangs that would ambush caravans and vanish before soldiers could respond. The Roman state addressed this through patrols and the placement of military outposts at strategic points. Watchtowers overlooked key junctions, and auxiliary troops were stationed in frontier provinces to secure travel. Yet despite these precautions, risk remained. Travelers often hired guards or joined larger groups to reduce vulnerability. Safety was never guaranteed. Life along the road also gave rise to a particular kind of establishment. The mancio, or official inn, and the capona, the private inn for common travelers. Mansions served government officials and couriers, offering food, stabling, and accommodations. Their costs were covered by local communities, a burden that often fell heavily on provincial towns. For ordinary travelers, caponi were available, but not always respectable. Ancient sources often describe them as dirty, noisy, and filled with questionable company. Beds were straw-stuffed sacks shared between strangers. Meals were basic: bread, olives, beans, and cheap wine. Rats and fleas were frequent companions. Yet for those unable to camp by the roadside, they provided a roof and a meal. More refined travelers might carry their own bedding, cookware, and provisions, preferring to stop in fields or under trees rather than risk theft or poor hygiene. For many, the journey was as much a test of endurance as it was a means of reaching a destination. As people, goods, and messages moved along the highways, so too did ideas. Roads became conduits of culture, carrying Roman law, language, and customs deep into the provinces. Latin words crept into local dialects. Roman fashions appeared in provincial towns. Temples, amphitheaters, and baths sprang up at crossroads, their designs carried by architects and stonemasons from one region to another. Religions also spread along the roads. Soldiers returning from campaigns brought home new gods. Merchants carried tales of foreign rituals and practices. In time, Christianity itself traveled the same paths, moving from small gatherings in Judea to communities scattered throughout the empire. Without the roads, such diffusion would have been slow, fragmented, and perhaps impossible. For the ordinary citizen, the experience of the road was often one of monotony punctuated by hardship. Distances were long, and most people traveled on foot. A day's journey might cover only 15 to 20 miles. Sandals wore thin against the rough stones. Cloaks grew heavy. With rain, travelers faced the constant challenge of fatigue, hunger, and weather. Yet the promise of reaching a market, visiting family, or seeking work in another town kept them moving. And yet, even in their exhaustion, travelers knew that the road offered something precious: predictability. Unlike muddy tracks or seasonal paths, the Roman road was always there, waiting, firm underfoot and stretching into the horizon. It did not guarantee safety, nor did it spare one from discomfort, but it offered a clear direction, a path that led with certainty toward a destination. By the height of the empire, Rome's road network extended for over 250,000 miles, with more than 50,000 miles paved. It was a marvel of organization, engineering, and persistence. But it also carried with it questions that linger even today. Was this vast network truly a gift to those who lived under Roman rule, or was it a tool of domination? For the provinces, the road brought markets, communication, and opportunity. Yet it also brought legions, taxes, and the weight of imperial authority. Every mile that connected a town to Rome also tethered it to the empire's demands. So when you picture a Roman road stretching endlessly before you, imagine not just the stones beneath your feet but also the invisible threads of commerce, law, and power it carried. These roads were more than highways of stone. They were the lifelines of an empire, shaping the rhythm of daily life for centuries. And yet, one must wonder, if the roads bound the empire together so tightly, what would happen when the system faltered, when maintenance lapsed, when armies could no longer patrol, when commerce slowed? Could the empire survive if its roads no longer carried its lifeblood? By the 3rd century of the Common Era, the Roman road system had reached its fullest extent. Its lines spread like veins across the empire, pulsing with soldiers, merchants, envoys, and pilgrims. For centuries, these highways had given Rome its strength. But nothing in history remains unchanged forever. Just as the roads had once symbolized stability and power, they would also become witnesses to decline, fragmentation, and transformation. The first cracks in the system were not dramatic collapses but slow neglect. Maintaining roads was costly. Bridges needed repairs, paving stones wore down under heavy wheels, ditches filled with silt, and milestones toppled with age. In the days of Augustus and the early emperors, central funding and local pride kept the network in good condition. Officials competed to inscribe their names on milestones as proof of their service to the public good. But by the 3rd century, the empire faced mounting crises, plagues, invasions, inflation, and political instability. Resources that once paid for road crews were diverted to fortifications, emergency armies, and imperial luxuries. Local communities, already burdened with taxes, resented the additional responsibility of upkeep. In many regions, repairs slowed or stopped altogether. Travelers began to notice. Where once paving stones lay smooth and even, weeds sprouted through cracks. Bridges sagged under their own weight. Rainwater pooled in neglected ditches, eroding the substructure. Roads that had been marvels of durability turned uneven, forcing carts to creak and sway dangerously. In the provinces, where distance already strained imperial oversight, the decline was most visible. Another factor was the changing nature of Rome's power. In the early centuries, roads allowed Rome to project its authority outward, carrying legions swiftly into hostile territory. By the later empire, the focus shifted inward, toward defense rather than expansion. Frontiers hardened, and armies were stationed permanently along borders rather than marching deep into foreign lands. This change meant that fewer new roads were built. Instead, resources went into strengthening walls, watchtowers, and forts. The great highways still mattered, but their strategic importance lessened in comparison to fortified frontiers like Hadrian's Wall or the Limes Germanicus. Where expansion had once been the empire's heartbeat, survival now became its priority. Ironically, the very roads that had once enabled Rome's dominance also smoothed the path for its enemies. When Germanic tribes, Persians, Goths, and later Huns pushed into Roman territory, they often followed the empire's own highways. Paved routes offered easier passage for invaders just as they had for legions centuries before. The sack of Rome in 410 CE by Alaric and the Visigoths, though shocking, was not the first instance of enemies marching on the Eternal City. Time and again, invaders moved swiftly along the crumbling highways, exploiting what had once been the empire's strength. Roads that once symbolized unity now bore witness to disintegration. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire had fractured into smaller kingdoms. The centralized system that had once maintained the roads disappeared. Some routes fell into disuse, their paving stones scavenged for building houses, walls, or churches. Bridges collapsed and were never rebuilt. In rural areas, grass and soil reclaimed the surfaces, leaving faint traces of once great highways. Yet not all vanished. Some roads remained in constant use, especially those near large towns or along vital trade corridors. The Via Appia, for example, continued to serve travelers, though in far rougher condition than in its prime. In the Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, maintenance was better preserved, allowing parts of the road system to survive for centuries longer. Still, the unified vision of a road network stretching seamlessly across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East was gone. The arteries had broken apart, and with them the beating heart of Rome's interconnected world. In the centuries after Rome's collapse in the West, roads never entirely disappeared. But their function shifted. The medieval traveler faced challenges far greater than his Roman predecessor. Bridges lay in ruins, paths narrowed, and forests encroached on once clear routes. Banditry flourished in the absence of centralized authority. A journey that might once have taken days stretched into weeks, filled with uncertainty and danger. And yet, the memory of the Roman roads lingered. Pilgrims walking to shrines like Santiago de Compostela in Spain or Canterbury in England often followed stretches of ancient highways. Merchants traced old routes as best they could, keeping alive a shadow of the empire's infrastructure. Even when stones were gone, the paths themselves remained etched into the landscape, guiding new generations of travelers. While practical use declined, the symbolic weight of Roman roads grew. Medieval chroniclers looked back on them as marvels of a lost age, monuments to a power no longer present. In some regions, people attributed their construction not to ordinary men but to giants or mythical kings, unable to imagine that such feats of engineering could have been human work. The roads became part of Europe's collective memory, silent reminders of a time when distant lands had been joined under one authority. They spoke of permanence, order, and grandeur, even as weeds covered their stones. Centuries later, during the Renaissance, scholars and travelers began to rediscover the old Roman routes with new eyes. Antiquarians mapped them, studied inscriptions on milestones, and marveled at bridges still standing after 1,000 years. Engineers took inspiration from their design, and rulers dreamed once more of roads that could unify kingdoms. In Italy, France, and beyond, new road-building efforts often followed the lines first laid by Roman surveyors. The Via Flaminia, the Via Aurelia, and others became foundations for modern highways. The bones of Rome's system were too well laid to be erased, shaping transportation for centuries to come. Even today, the ghost of the Roman road lingers beneath our feet. Modern Europe's highways and railways often trace the same corridors first carved into the land 2 millennia ago. The logic of those early surveyors, finding the most direct route, building solid foundations, connecting towns at regular intervals, remains the logic of modern infrastructure. More than that, the Roman road endures as an idea, the promise that connectivity fosters strength. Just as the empire bound its provinces through paved stones, so do modern nations rely on networks of highways, railroads, and digital cables to link their people. The principle has not changed, only the technology. So, as you picture the empire's roads fading into ruin, try to see both sides of their story. They were practical, yes, carrying carts, soldiers, and letters. But they were also symbols, binding together the lives of millions across continents. Their rise mirrored Rome's ascent, their decline mirrored its fall, and their endurance shaped the world that followed. When you walk a modern street in London, Paris, or Rome, chances are that beneath the asphalt lies the path of an ancient Roman road. The stones may be gone, the milestones toppled, but the line remains, guiding travelers as it has for 2,000 years. And it is worth asking, do roads shape empires, or do empires shape roads? Was Rome strong because it built them, or did the roads themselves create the unity that allowed Rome to endure so long? Perhaps the answer lies not in stone, but in the steps of every traveler who has ever followed the line of a road into the horizon.